welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Okay, guys, tonight I'm gonna bring up Nick Fuentes again. Of course, he's all over the news lately. You guys know that, but tonight it's not politics. It's a little bit of religion and history regarding Protestantism, as he's making waves again across the ex community, particularly being attacked by Protestants. And so I'll tell you what, let me go to the share screen here, guys. Let me pull this up here. Let me see if I can find this here. Let's see here. Yeah, here it is here. Okay. So, um, let me play this for you here. This has Protestants flipping out, right? Here we go. Put it on here.
Hey Nick, you're actually retarded. Without the Protestant Reformation, you wouldn't be allowed to read the Bible you establishment cut.
And probably for the better, actually. People reading the Bible is what gave us like transgender pastors, and it gave us Steven Anderson, and it gave us a lot of it. Like, we would be better off, I think, if we didn't. And I think we'd be better off if we didn't, if we received instruction from the clerics.
Formidable Youth sent $27. The minorities.
This is where we get like liberals saying, but the Bible says neither Jew nor Greek, but the Bible says, this is where you get liberals using it against us.
Formidable Youth sent $27.
All right, let me stop there. So, of course, this is a sensitive topic for the Protestants who believe, of course, the Bible is the end all in terms of our relationship with God via the man-made doctrine of sola scriptura, which was invented in the 16th century. And of course, they would take offense to this because they believe the Bible is sole rule of faith. Of course, as Catholics, we don't believe that. But I think the point here that Nick is making, despite the outrage of the Protestants, it's right on because the personal interpretation factor of sola scriptura is what's been really the driving force for the disintegration of Western civilization. I mean, we go all the way back to the Protestant revolt, don't get me wrong, but even just going back to the Enlightenment, we begin to see the deterioration of the West at the hands of Protestants, particularly in Protestant lands all over, well, really all of Northern Europe, let's call it right there. And then, of course, we see that spreading out into all the offshoots of the British Empire. I mean, look at it this way. I've talked about this before. Look at the Protestant revolts match online. Everything north, basically, of what, Bavaria, right? The Netherlands, the Scandinavian nations, which include what, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, right? Go into now um, the England and all of its sort of colonial empire offshoots, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all these nations that were Protestant after the Reformation are really the most liberal nations on the face of the planet. I mean, there is a direct correlation to the sort of infusement of liberalism in Western society with Protestantism and that step that they took during that period in history. And what do they all have in common? A subjective morality. Because when you have subjective morality or personal interpretation, it's hard to conform any overarching sort of religious beliefs that transcends into culture and eventually politics. When everybody gets to pick and choose their own rules, when everybody gets to declare themselves their own individual pope, and then you have to create a great conformist society, right? Of different contradicting beliefs oftentimes, you don't have any hegemony whatsoever, not religious, not cultural, not political at the end of the day. And to dismiss this, this historical fact, I think is a grand mistake. Let me give you an example. There's another guy on X. His name is Redeem Zoomer. Young guy, has some strange, odd kind of thing about all the mainline Protestant churches are the real Christianity, and all the offshoots that go into the non-institutionalized forms of Protestantism, like the Pentecostals and the evangelicals. That's not true Christianity. He would actually consider as problematic and as erroneous as Catholicism is. He would say Catholics are real Christians, but the evangelicals and the Protestants are not real Christians, right? Because he believes in the institutionalizing factor of Protestantism, right? Because those older Protestant sects, the ones that pretty much all fallen apart, they had confessionals and they were, they had their own testimonies and traditions and history, right? Okay, an odd kind of a strange belief. I have my opinions on that. But his point is, and he says this a lot, is that, and you could tell that he struggles with it, is he always tries to address why Protestant nations eventually become liberal, right? And his excuse for that is the fact that, well, Protestant nations are very successful. And when you're successful and you're comfortable, liberalization tends to follow, right? He'll quote something, I believe, in the Old Testament saying where God said this in the Bible, obviously. And in fact, the liberalization of Protestant nations is the fact that they're successful, particularly material success, right? Too much material prosperity leads to liberalism. Now, it's interesting because Redeemed Zoomer's kind of changed his tune on that because just a couple months ago he was saying sometimes Protestant nations become liberal. And of course, I challenged him on this a couple months back, and I said, "Well, tell me the Protestant nation that hasn't become liberal. All Protestant nations become liberal, and it's beyond liberalism, right? They turn atheistic and eventually satanic. I mean, look at all the liberal nations today. Again, particularly those in the northern part of the hemisphere in Europe and all of its the British Empire offshoots. Not only are they vastly liberal progressive nations, but they are the ones ushering in the New World Order. They're the ones doing this. And so to say that sometimes, well, he's changed his tune on that. He's not saying sometimes. He realizes now that there's a problem with Protestant nations. Now he's concocted another excuse, and that is, well, we're just too successful, right? And this is the high society argument, the argument that Protestant societies build, high societies, great material wealth, all the comforts and pleasures and technology in the modern world. And of course, other nations that are not Protestant are low societies, right? I had a friend of mine on Facebook that basically pointed us out how the British created high society with all these great achievements, and the Latin Catholic nations, of course, have fallen behind in terms of prosperity, in terms of, again, not being able to build, great societies or great economic sort of civilizations that highlight the best of humanity, right? It's this almost an emphasis on this material prosperity. Now, that's fascinating because we've had many great Catholic societies in the past, high societies in the past, and of course that's all ignored. But of course, we're now talking about the transformation of civilization and how Protestant societies are able to maintain sort of this high status, right? This great economic prosperity. For one, they emphasize on the material. Unlike Catholics, where we believe that, yeah, the material is important, but the higher goal, of course, is to reach God. This is why, at the end of the day, Catholic nations, right, prior to World War II, because remember, after World War II, it's a game changer because all the Catholic nations basically were piled upon by the liberal nations of the West, and of course the communists after the war, and now the Catholic nations were basically overthrown as a result of World War II, and liberalism and ultimately Marxism infused on them. So it's a different kind of situation. This is, by the way, why we have a church crisis, because after the death of Mussolini, you had no more temporal defender of the church, and now the church could be easily infiltrated, leading to the current modern problems that we have today. Well, this, of course, affected all Catholic nations, at least those in Western Europe, right? Whether it's Spain, Portugal, Italy, Austria, and certain parts of Germany, of course, as well too. But in terms of the idea of high society, well, I mean, the Protestant nations did adopt usury as part of their economic system. And this is why they were able to be brutal in their colonial transgressions all over the world. I mean, listen, the British Empire was the empire where the sun never sets. They went into other nations all over the globe, Africa, the Asian Pacific, and they took whatever they needed to become prosperous. This is different than Catholic nations who didn't have as big of a foothold in colonialization as, say, the British Empire or the French, which were a very liberal nation. Now, of course, people say, well, yeah, but the France was a Catholic nation at one time, and look at that fell sort of to the transgressions of liberalism. True, but France was also infiltrated by Masonry, right? We know that. We know that the Enlightenment itself was not a byproduct of Catholicism. This is why the Vendée went to their death fighting for their king and for the church is what they were doing. There's something else going on in France that gave way, right? An infiltration of Masonic principles. If you read that about the French Revolution, it was anything but Catholic, or even a disgruntled Catholics in that nation. A lot of other groups filtered in there because the French were particularly targeted. And I would suggest they were targeted for what, in some ways, many Catholic monarchs had done to these fringe groups, especially, when they had ousted the Jews or burned the Talmud in I believe, the ninth, 10th century, right around there. France became a target. But also, here's the other reason why France was a nation state for many centuries. So they were an easy target, right? It's going to be much more difficult to target, say, Italy, which wasn't unified because Italy was a disunified land, right, of different provinces and regions. Much more difficult to take over a bunch of little provinces. You got to wait until that nation is unified, which happens in the 1860s under Garibaldi. Then Italy could become a bigger target. And that's what World War II was. I can't comment as much about Spanish history. I know they had a monarch there, but see, the difference between the French and the Spanish is, well, the Spanish had an Inquisition. They moved out all those uh, duplicitous citizens that were a threat to the hegemony of the nation. The French debated whether they were going to have an Inquisition and decided to go against it, and they allowed those groups that were not Catholic, those groups that ultimately wanted to overthrow that society. They allowed those ideologies to fester. This is how we get Masonry and all these strange kind of alternative religions and spiritual movements that eventually upends the entire nation in France, right? Spain decided to protect their cultural and Catholic hegemony. Some people may have a problem with that because we have all these black legends of the terrible things that were done, but they had an Inquisition. They protected their cultural and religious hegemony. Spain effectively stayed Catholic until the death of Franco. I believe that was in 77, might have been 73, right around there, right? The French decided not to. And all these various groups that had targeted the Catholic, sort of the Catholic faith and the Catholic nation, were able eventually to overthrow France. And that's how we get the French Revolution. And what was once considered the eldest daughter of the church, France, that fell. But really, France in some ways was an anomaly in the Catholic world because even with the Germans, and Germany's a little different too because that was the home of the European front of the Protestant revolt. It was kind of split 50-50 between Protestants and Catholics, but you always had enough Catholics to kind of keep Germany in check to a certain degree. But once, England broke away from the church, yeah, you have some brave Catholics, without a doubt, in England that were martyred, sacrificed everything for defending the faith, but you didn't have the same mix ultimately of Protestants and Catholics in that nation, and the Protestant ruling class became dominant. And for that matter, England became a Protestant nation, and all of its offshoots by de facto became Protestant as well too. But again, we get back to the fundamental question here, and that is, why is it that Protestant nations always go liberal? Why is that? It's a question that I think is fascinating. I'm not buying the excuse that it's overwhelmingly economic prosperity that leads to that, because I think we could look at some of the contradictory theological principles. And again, I'll go back to the idea of conformity. What do you do when you have various sects and groups just on a theological basis that disagree? Well, in order for Protestants to stay in peace, so they're always not killing each other because of theological differences, you have to build a conformist society, which means you have to sacrifice certain values. It's like I say all the time, like this religious liberty thing, or at least this Protestantized religious liberty thing we have in America. Well, listen, as long as we follow the top 10 points of the faith, the big ones, guys, right? Don't murder, don't kill, don't commit adultery. As long as we follow the big ones, we're going to be fine. But it's like I've said, it's the bottom 10 points of the faith that actually form you properly. So you can follow the top 10 points of the faith, right? One example I'll give where uh, Protestant theology has absolutely literally failed is on the issue of contraception. Because for the first 1900 years of Christendom, all Christian denominations banned contraception. They saw it as a great moral evil. It's condemned in the Old Testament. But for some reason, post-industrial revolution in the 1920s, right around there, 30s, the Lutheran Church began to relent and basically say, yeah, nothing wrong with contraception. And all the Protestant sects after that began to ensue, began to follow suit with what the Lutherans had done. As a result, what did we get? We got the sexual revolution in the 1960s. And through the sexual revolution, we got the complete degenerate society that we're all living through today. You think it's a coincidence that after contraception was was accepted by the Lutherans, we begin this mass depopulation of Western society? Now, some people will say, well, that was already happening because of the Industrial Revolution. This is true. This is true. But don't tell me the contraception issue didn't affect that. Because now we've reached a point where we're not even replacing ourselves in the West. We have dying Christian nations because Christians are not having kids anymore. Even if you want to say that, post-industrial revolution, let's call it the 1830s, 40s, right around there, the fertility rates were dropping, still Christian nations were still having children across the board more than they needed to maintain high fertility rates. So these nations are growing. It's one of the things I told you about Mussolini, right? Mussolini banned contraception in Italy. Why? Because he believed a nation doesn't have kids and doesn't expand its population is a dying nation, right? We've never heard anything of that nature from Protestant nations. In fact, Protestants purposely sterilize their people as an answer to the lack of resources or economic sort of viability to any nation that would be struggling with that. And what has that led to? Dying populations all over the West. This is a clear byproduct of Protestantism. And Protestantism, again, ushering in liberalism, ultimately the New World Order at the end of the day. Let's go down now to the 1960s, right? Divorce and remarriage. In the Catholic Church, it's still considered a mortal sin. The church has never caved in on that. We can have a discussion about annulments, but at least that's a structured process, right? And we could debate that and talk about that some other time, what that actually means. But for the Protestants, they completely relented without any standards. At the very least, in the Catholic world, you have a church structure that overlooks these things. But again, because of the personal interpretation, the subjective morality of sola scriptura, in Protestant world, every couple is allowed to decide for themselves what justifies divorce and remarriage. Hence, Supreme Court in America, which is Holy Mother Church now, because we got away from the church in America as a Protestant nation and focus on this individualism, legalized no-fault divorce 1960s. What was the byproduct of that? Well, we saw it in 1990s, the absolute breakdown of the family, right? I've talked about it before. Look at the timeline, right? Where, again, divorce is made legal, and then from there on, one step after, well, it really begins with contraception. Let's be honest here, okay? Because while the Lutheran Church approved the use of contraception, there was still a civilizational pushback. The pill isn't actually made over the counter until 1961. Okay, so the Lutheran Church is sort of building the foundations of this alternative subjective morality on the issue of contraception. The moment contraception is made legal over the counter in 1961, what do we see? I mean, obviously, the moral degeneracy we're all living through, but it's step by step. Contraception, 1961, then no fault divorce is legalized, pornography, abortion, right? We get, then to the 1990s, where we begin to really see the fruition of the no fault divorce thing and all the broken families, right? What do we have? Murphy Brown, and we don't need fathers in the home, single moms raising children, right? We get the grunge music, which is basically the offshoots of divorced Protestant parents who have their kids now that are angry. If you listen to Nirvana, particularly the lead singer there, what was his name? I forget his name now. He passed away. There's a famous recording of him on YouTube basically saying everything was fine until my parents got divorced. Everything was fine. What was grunge music? It was mainly kids that came from Protestant homes where their parents got divorced and their lives have been turned upside down. And the 90s is a complete breakdown of the family. Don't get me wrong, it was happening in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But the full fruition, right, as symbolized by the election of Bill Clinton, if he smoked that weed or, with the blue dress and all that stuff, but the family began to deteriorate. And by the time we get to the 2000s, what are we talking about? We're talking about domestic partnerships. Eventually, gay marriage is legalized. And now it's all about transgenderism. Is Fuentes wrong when he says, guess what? Protestantism leads to, transgenderism and gay pastors. No, he's not. Not if you follow the timeline. And this is all a byproduct of Protestantism. Tell me why, prior to World War II, why this wasn't happening in Catholic nations. Why? It wasn't. They were morally sound nations. They fought against abortion. Well, they were all illegal. Contraception, right? Easy peasy divorce. None of this was legal. The Catholic Church maintained a solid moral foundation. Why? Because the church was in place. Because, as Fuentes says here, he thinks we're better off going to the pastors, having the pastors read the Bible and the Gospels to us, giving us a proper interpretation. And this is what the church did. It was able to maintain order, saying, based on sacred tradition, based on the doctrines of the church, based on the saints, based on the mystics, based on everything we know through sacred tradition, divorce and remarriage is wrong. It's wrong. But in the Protestant world, how do you control that? Because in the Protestant world, there is no self-sacrifice. Your God can be the happy Jesus God like we have, in Utah, where the cross has been removed. The concept of sacrifice no longer exists. And it's always happy Jesus everywhere, right? Well, and really all the Protestant churches do that. That's why when you go into these bland and sterile Protestant churches, even the old line Protestant churches, they have empty crosses. Because it's to remind you that, okay, Jesus made the sacrifice. We don't have to partake of sacrifices. We could just enjoy our time when, in fact, life is more than that, right? Because the Gospels themselves, the Bible itself says, we too have to carry our cross just as the Lord did. But the Protestants never wanted to carry the cross. They wanted, ultimately to enjoy their time, right? And not to say that there isn't moments of joy and happiness that we can have in this world, in this fallen world. But it highlights the problem with Protestant theology, why it leads to liberalism always in the end, because of these subjective personal opinions that are formed based upon the individual human will without any overarching authority that can do a fraternal correction or properly form hearts and minds. I gave Charlie Kirk, and God bless his soul, Charlie Kirk. I gave Kirk a hard time when he brought the porn star on to his Talking Points USA event a few months back before he was assassinated. And I criticized that, saying, listen, you can't bring on porn stars because they found Jesus 15 minutes ago. Now, I'm happy for this young lady. I'm glad she found faith. But that faith has to be tested. Anybody who's lived that kind of a violent, greatly immoral lifestyle needs to go away and live a life of prayer and penance, not to be put up on a pedestal. And see, here is where the Protestants, well, but she's a great example. She came to Christ, and look where we're at now with this young lady. She's online now, a year and a half into this, selling Bible courses. Who doesn't even understand the basic premise of theology? She had an emotional experience, and I don't doubt that it could have been real. But former porn stars, a year from being in the industry, shouldn't be teaching Christianity. They shouldn't be social influencers. That's a problem. It's a big problem. And now the young lady has turned from a porn star grifter into a sola scriptura grifter. That's what she's turned into. And I predicted this. And many people now are looking at this young lady and say, wow, Charlie really did this? Charlie really did this? Again, with Charlie, I hope he's basking in God's kingdom. I'm just bringing this up as an example of the problem with Protestant theology. To say that Protestant nations liberalize because they're too successful materially, absolutely, absolutely, what do you call it? Delusional. Delusional. When in fact, Catholic nations have persisted. Not that the Catholic nations have been perfect, right? There's a fallen nature that we all have. Every generation has to deal with this fallen nature. But when you look at sort of the baseline, when we go foundations of civilization in the West, Catholic nations prior to World War II were solid. They weren't going through all these forms of liberalization. Now, don't get me wrong, there's always movements and people are pushing for issues, but it was much harder to get a lot of this moral depravity entrenched via law and culture. In Italy to this day, I believe still to this day, or it was this way, I don't know the laws exactly, it took like a decade just to get a divorce. That's the influence of the church on the culture. Same in Mexico, another Catholic nation, right? Or was Catholic. You know, the American government during the time of the Cristeros, siding with the Freemasonic government, doomed the Catholics in that nation. Don't get me wrong, because everything America touches, because it's a liberal nation, it kind of screws up historically, but that's a different issue for another time. But my point is, these Catholic nations understood that easy peasy divorce without good reason leads to the destruction of the family. The destruction of the family leads to the destruction of culture. The destruction of culture leads to the corruption of the political system. Don't tell me your subjective interpretation of of the Bible doesn't matter and doesn't have any effect. Guys, this is ridiculous. Protestants and Protestantism has been a curse on Western society. That's all I can say. All you got to do is study a little bit of history. Now, if you're Protestant, you want to defend your heritage, I understand that, but I think you're being dishonest. Everything Protestantism touches, it destroys. Nations, cultures, families, ushers in the New World Order, aka Satanism, right? And this is one of the arguments that E. Michael Jones has been making. His new book, Walking with the Gun on the Barrel, that's his ultimate point, is Protestantism ushers in atheism, right? Look at the situation we're in. Another great example in America, where all of a sudden now, under the guise of freedom of religion created in a Protestant nation, now we're building satanic temples basically right next to Christian churches. Something that never would have happened in any other Catholic nation, because there would have been a mechanism of authority in place to say, wait a minute, this isn't Christianity. We don't allow this. But in America, in a Protestant nation, Protestants now are allowing satanic churches to be built in the open. It's quite amazing, guys. Don't give me this crap about, oh, too much prosperity. It's bad Protestant theology. It is bad rendering of scripture. And ultimately, It is the man-made doctrine of sola scriptura, a doctrine concocted by a bunch of Protestants at the time who were struggling with their own sins and didn't want to fight the good fight. And it was easier for them to simply renegotiate the terms and conditions with God after 1600 years. Much easier to do that because of these guys, right? And that's what they did. Isn't that really the story, though? Isn't that always the story with humanity? They don't like God's rules, so they want to renegotiate the terms and conditions. And here we are, ladies and gentlemen. That's what sola scriptura is. That's why Protestant nations suck. That's why everything they touch, they destroy, from the culture to the family to the politics. They usher in progressivism, and ultimately, they've ushered in the complete collapse on the West, all weighted on the doctrine of sola scriptura. So in this case here, Nick was absolutely right. He nailed it. I don't care how mad they are. I just laid out the case for you. All right, guys, that's it right there. I think I'm gonna wrap it up here. Let me see here. Let me stop the share. So guys, listen, I go on these rants every once in a while. I'll get back to some of the more serious stuff. Well, I mean, this is serious, don't get me wrong, but I got another episode coming up on my Mussolini series. I got an idea for one of my episodes on my Integralist Chronicles as well too, and anything that may come up in the news. One thing that's happening, I may start touching more on is economics because there is a real problem out there with the cost of living and Americans truly suffering in terms of economic viability with the inflation and everything that's going on. Maybe I'll start to touch on some of those issues. Anyways, I'm going to wrap it up for tonight. I want to thank you for joining me. This is Frank signing off, frankly speaking. Good night, everybody.